my son, I have an older teenage son. He's into aquariums, and he has an aquarium that he established and is cultivating, and it's got fish, it's got plants, it's really grown into something. It's 45 gallons, and we've talked about this often. That he is essentially imitating God by creating this world. He's creating a world. He's making a world, and it's really hard, actually. But he's participating in God's act of creation by creating his own world. If Aristotle's right, and we're fundamentally wired for contemplation, thinking, action, which is sort of acting in the world in some capacity, perhaps moral agents, perhaps in the political sphere, and as makers, then each of us have all three of those within us, and all three of those ultimately come back to God as the source of our being. So yes, in a sense, we are all wired for knowing, doing, and making. But we all know that some of us have more of one of those than the other, right? And as I have done very little creating in my life. I did play an instrument for a while, but most of my experience is contemplating beauty. So I do think all of us have that. That doesn't mean that we're somehow less than human if we don't do all three, or we don't do a lot of making. I think some of us make in different ways. Some of us cook, some of us do other things. We make maybe using more abstract things. But I think that is, we are imitating in some sense. But we're also imitating in a sense that we're usually what this involves is that the making that we all do it in some way, if not every day, is we're bringing order to disorder. We're bringing from chaos into an ordering. And that ordering, I think you touched upon, is bigger than us. It has an objective dimension. And in a sense, if I'm thinking here of Tolkien, the opening of the Silmarillion, his introduction of how the world was created through singing, the ordering of song, but also in a sense the fall took place through song. I'm thinking of Lewis's The Magician's Nephew, where Aslan sings creation into being. The Book of Wisdom, where it talks from sacred scripture, where he talks about God creating the world through weight, measure, and number. There's a real sense in which, by bringing order out of chaos, we're again imitating the divine maker. And that creation itself is fundamentally ordered. So when we enter into beauty, like thinking of Marathon again, and we enter into that contemplation, we're actually contemplating an objective order that is ordered all the way down to the most basic level. There's a medieval author who wrote in the 14th century who said that even the dynamic in the Trinity, the Trinitarian dynamic between the persons, is itself a kind of music. So in a sense, there's music from top to bottom. And Boethius famously talked about the music of the human body, how our soul is tuned to our body, right? And the parts of our body are tuned. And the music of the spheres, the cosmos itself is tuned. So there's a sense in which beauty, either sensory or at a more abstract level, permeates all of reality. And then we can't help but bring order to things. We can't help but make. But by engendering it and bringing it to birth, it can't help but have our own stamp. And if that's by what we mean by self-expression, then absolutely. We're pressing out, if you will, from ourselves parts of who we are into what we make, right? And it's like someone having a conversation who their primary concern is just to talk. They're not interested in listening. And what we're doing, I wish I could listen a lot more. You keep asking me these questions, Marguerite. I have to keep answering them. But I love dialogues because you can just be quiet and listen, right? And so this is how it's wired. If we go to the question of education, the students in our schools and our classrooms, they're coming from that with that same fundamental nature, right? They're wired for knowing, for doing, and for making. And there will be students that we introduce beauty to. Remember, you don't begin with the reflection, with the analysis. You reflect, you expose them to beautiful things. You present them to them, right? And some are going to respond very deeply with contemplation. Some of them are going to respond deeply with contemplation, and then they're going to make as well. And we just don't know, but we introduce it to our students. It's a bit like breathing bad air. You don't even know what good air is like until you breathe it and you go, wow, I can breathe. Or you only eat really bad food, right? And then you taste good food, like, wow. Most of these students and kids, they have no idea really what the goods of beauty are, right? Until we introduce them. There is to go back to one of your other questions, there is a danger of professionalizing it. of making it, you become so caught up in the technique, in the analysis. I was having a conversation with a good friend recently, and we basically talked about how music majors generally don't get to experience the liberal arts very much, because the focus is so much on technique, and on performance and production, that you really have no time to contemplate. And so it's difficult to cultivate that habit to where you can actually listen for beauty. You can actually listen and contemplate in the whole. And the difference here is the whole versus the parts. That analytical dimension is you're constantly looking at the movement from one thing to another, the part to part, the part to whole. And there's a place for that. There's a place for that. But I think we really have to begin by listening to the whole, then going to the parts, and then returning to the whole. And one hopes that you'll have a more informed, deeper understanding when you go to the whole again, through the analysis of the parts. But this isn't, as a composer that I knew used to describe it, it's not about pulling the arms off the doll and seeing what's inside. You've got to enjoy the fullness and the completeness of the whole. Yeah, it's hard if in some ways, studying music professionally, or as your main focus, it really can rob you of your appreciation of beauty if you're not careful.